Thanks a lot for your nice welcome. Welcome to the Platform City panel or discussion. My name is Florian Wüst. I co-curated this edition of the IMPAKT Festival together with Erik Bünge. In less than 2 decades, platform technologies have radically transformed urban space. Companies such as Airbnb, Amazon, and Google embody not only new types of enterprises, but also a new culture of how we use their products and services in everyday life. These and other tech giants also engage in the development of smart city concepts that promote data-based solutions to problems of sustainability, energy saving, and mobility. Modern urbanization has always been a biopolitical project, a technology aimed at the spatial organization and management of bodies and minds. How does the integration of urban design, ubiquitous computing, sensing technologies, and financialized capital act upon the human body and its relationship to time and space? This panel is connected to Good Life, a film from 2022 from this year by Marta Dauliūtė and Viktorija Šiaulytė. We screened yesterday here in this space. It revolves around new startup models for co-working and co-living that render social life as a business operation. For Platform City, the filmmakers, here to my right, are joined by Ross Exo Adams, architect, urban theorist, and assistant professor and co-director of the architecture program at Bard College, New York, and Sarah Kim, a Stockholm-based curator and member of Mapping the Unjust City, an interdisciplinary group and ongoing art and research project exploring aesthetics and pedagogy in relation to ownership and capital flows in cities. Together, we want to discuss the making infrastructure of the body and how the techno-colonization of cities can be turned around to favor non-extractive practices that help us to face the planetary crises ahead of us. So we're going to have a first 15-minute input by Sarah, who will present Mapping the Unjust City's collective work around property ownership in Stockholm and the narratives and social relationships that derive from it in contrast to the other sides of today's housing crises. So to some extent, Sarah will provide a context to Good Life, who had been zooming into one particular co-living project and venture in central Stockholm. Sarah, before I start, I think I'm sure you're with me, if we could have a little light on the audience, because we look into this dark space and it reminds me of Zoom conferences, and we are not on Zoom here. Also, I'm very happy to be joined by our online audience. I think that's much better, isn't it? Okay, Sarah, thank you.
Okay, hi. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. We're really happy to be here. And so I'm part of a group called Mapping the Unjust City. We are 7 members, and we have all different backgrounds. Some of us work in fine arts, architecture, aesthetics, social anthropology, and curatorial practices, graphic design. So we're like a mixed bunch. And the group was formed in 2015. And some of us have also been involved in housing struggles and organizing together for the right to the city. So we've been presenting our work in art and architecture exhibitions and doing workshops, but also in grassroots initiatives and at occupations. So I'm just going to go into why we love maps, I guess. Maps show us where we are and how to get somewhere else. In doing so, they also have an identity reinforcing and maybe identity constitutive function. This is a quote by Lara Kurgan. So they not only help navigate, but also locate oneself. It is a tool for orientation, which is kind of obvious, but yeah. Maps always contain a certain grade of idealization, In maps of the city, you rarely see roadworks or deforestation when forests are portrayed. A map often represents something and is supposed to be analog with certain conditions relating to that place. In other words, the map corresponds to something outside the map, and as a result, it's the selections and exclusions and distance and coding that is going on. And since every map of the world mediates and suggests, it suggests a particular worldview. The maps have an influence on us. They might naturalize a particular perspective of the world and legitimize territorial status quo. Maps are not only tools for designing physical space, but they create discursive, mental, virtual, and political spaces. The hegemonic history of making of maps could be said to have connote authoritarian regimes and colonial Eurocentric approaches to the world. The philosopher Michel de Certeau claims the bird's eye view creates a fiction of knowledge. The map will hinder the mapping as we come to be captivated by the fetishes of scale and precision that smooth over the world's contradictions. This is a quote by Toscano and Kinkel. So we see that maps also eliminate certain details that can be kind of violent and brutal, and you get more captivated in another way. And so there's challenges also to working with the aesthetics of mapping. So we view our work as a part of the tradition of the field of critical cartography and counter-mapping. Counter-mapping can be a strategy to visualize narratives and relationships which are not obvious at first sight. It can be claimed that maps and mappings have emancipatory potential. We believe that mapping practices can be used to highlight injustices within the built environment and propose alternative spatial approaches. Counter-mapping or critical cartography can be said to be a concept for mapping practices that emanates from the basic assumption that maps and mappings mirror and create social power relations. Creations of maps can therefore be used to study power as well as to propose new power structures. In this regard, they also challenge mindsets, actions, and present realities. One thing to stress here is that methods can be as important as the results, and since the emphasis may lie in activating and mobilizing certain groups or narratives and ways of thinking. These are just some examples of inspiring maps. Since the global financial crisis in 2008, this term financialization has become a widely used term to describe the structural transformation of economies into dominance of financial actors. The global market structures and financial systems are complex, to say the least. At the same time, we have seen some artists trying to do mapping and deal with the situation and mapping as a method to understand and make understandable these processes. So I guess mappings cannot be reduced to practices that have maps as outcomes, but rather mappings can take all forms. And to go beyond the critique of existing maps, to see maps instead as unfolding potential, as conduits of possibilities, and as sites of imagination and action in the world. We might even say that the function of maps is to not to depict, but to enable. So we decided to map property ownership, and property ownership is fundamental for how our lives are organized. Dispossession and new enclosures are still the root and basis for production and accumulation. But this fundamental condition is not visible when walking through the city, and when the owner is made visible, it is usually on their terms. So it's problematic that knowledge about finance and ownership is reserved for a narrow layer of society, and for the majority it's difficult to access and to make sense of. This is a quote showing the mystification and abstraction is also a challenge, and that there are challenges to depicting the complex economic and financialization. And in a way, Yeah, this is a quote by Leclerc Lebargue, who was here yesterday, and she writes about aesthetics and political economy and claims that this mystification contributes to a dynamic of distance and serve to redirect critical attention away from the on-the-ground impacts of financialization. So these are images of the local centers that we have been mapping to take you to Stockholm. Many Stockholm suburbs are built as a part of the nationwide public housing program implemented in Sweden in the 1960s and 70s by the governing Social Democratic Workers' Party to make sure that everyone had a home at a reasonable price. These suburbs were built as nodes along the subway line, where you had housing, community services, and a local center or square in connection to each station. Though the scale and some would say monotony of these suburbs have often been criticized, the planning ideals of that time came from a belief in public ownership and provision to equal living conditions within the city. You could say these centers embodied an ideal of spatial justice. But since the 1980s, with the shift of political governance and the growing influence of neoliberalism, state and publicly owned spaces like these, and housing and welfare services have gradually been sold and privatized. Along with the gentrification and brutal clearances affecting the housing situation in these suburbs, the local centers have been particularly hotspots for global real estate investors. The selling of housing has time and time again sparked local resistance and the formation of protest groups and movements. But the selling of the local centers and shopping malls have largely gone under the radar, and so you might say that there is a knowledge deficiency on the issue. These local centers are or were usually the main public spaces of each suburb, owned and operated by the municipality and planned to uphold the daily life of the local community. On the surface, the centers still showcase an ideal of democracy from the era they were built, but the foundation of public ownership is no longer there. And as the properties are shifted from local affairs into products on the global market, we hope to point at this gap in our work and try to understand and see what the consequences of the changes of ownership involve and how it affects the activity and usage of these public spaces. This is one version of our map where we have little blue circles that show the degree of public accessibility. So the difference between the property and the public land and relating to the zoning plan. And this is also another version of the map. Here we have some logos so that you can see that, yeah, these big companies have taken over these centers. We've been really considering like the visual language around how to relay information about ownership and to show like the level of publicness and the history behind it. This map has some images of the owners along with the logos. And in these pictures of the individual owners, we try to sort of identify and show the faces of the company and as a strategy of making them more visible and thus accountable. But at the same time, we acknowledge that by highlighting these individuals, there's the risk of attributing the problem to like an individual or personal level rather than pointing at the inherent structures of capitalist system. And we also had little texts about each, what happened when the shift of ownership and what kind of resistance they met. We can look at the video now. There's a digital map that we developed about 2 years ago in collaboration with a programmer named Matthias Tervo. And here we have filters where you can see that which are publicly owned and privately owned, and a timeline to follow the privatization. And on each node you can read about the centers and the different owners and follow like the shift And there's an image also of the square there. In our research, we've both met people and talked to them about how they feel, and a lot of people don't realize who owns their local square, and other people are more aware, and they can see that it has changed the way that they use the squares. People talk about the increased level of security guards, for example, and also when demonstrating some of the privately owned squares, we've been forced to be pushed out of, and claiming we're not allowed to be here and demonstrate, but that's not true, because you have the right to demonstrate, but the private owners try to infringe on our rights. So there's a lot of things that happen because of the privatization. Okay. And just to go back to and relate to the film that we saw yesterday that was screened, Good Life, it was, for me, also a kind of mapping, I would say. It showed sort of the global mutations of capital and the hierarchies and the structures within the tech startup industry, exposing the contradictions and the contradictions to the seemingly horizontal facade that they promote. And the rhetoric and language that they use was very similar to the mantra that these venture capitalists and politicians that we've interviewed in our research also talk and promise about this overconfidence in the built environment, and that they will change and make a promising, bright future. But there's no denying that digitalization is transforming the ways of our life, and especially the organization of labor. And this comes with frictions and tensions. And so that promise of freedom and flexibility that the gig economy workers are sort of presented with and supposed to embody also smooths over and hides the fact that they are faced with higher sort of insecurity and risk with their zero-hour contracts and forced into labor conditions with no protection. So in a way, the digital city perpetuates and sustains capital, and it becomes sort of a motor for disciplining and separating workers. They have a harder time meeting and organizing. And there's smooth operations of the digital infrastructure that in capital, which provides an illusion of connectivity and mobility while constantly extracting data and exploiting workers. So I think the title also of the film, Good Life, is something that you can ask yourself, what is good life in the city now, and what has happened during these decades of privatization, and the spatial integrity that is kind of surprising also in the film, where they're living in these cramped quarters of this tech farm co-living space. It sort of very neatly reflects that there is a housing crisis, and it already exists in our cities, and a few stations away there's also migrant workers or working class families that are cramped in their homes as well, trying to survive. I have another little input. This weekend we have here an image of the European Action Coalition, which is a big meeting that they're having in Athens. And it's a transnational network for housing struggle. So at the same time, there are lots of organizings happening against these big corporations. And you can see here on the map, there's many different European cities that are part of it. Ort to Ort is the one in Stockholm that we're affiliated with. Ort to Ort means suburb to suburb or hood to hood. And in the second to last scene in the film, there was an image of the demonstration demanding for communalization of the housing in Berlin for the past few years. There's been a big campaign around this. I know Florian knows more about it. But I just wanted to also say that in Sweden, in the suburbs, we have a very similar campaign, and that the communalization of housing is one of the main sort of points for organizing right now. And the suburb here called Husby is actually owned, like the housing apartments are owned by a Swedish real estate company called Hemla, which changed their name to Viktorija Hem, and is owned by a German company called Vonovia. And so it's sort of like these trans-global corporations that have been buying up properties, and there's like Akelius is a Swedish one, and that's also over there. So I think there's a point also in showing that there's a sense of shared power through transnational organizing. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. That created already quite a good floor to our discussion. But I would pass on for the next input to Ross. You give a more historical and epistemological perspective on the body as a site of urbanization. And that's also, I think, to some extent in relation to two of your articles here in Platform Urbanism and its contents. You contributed an article on breath, and also in Influx Architecture magazine in 2017, your article becoming infrastructural. I think that's gonna reappear in your presentation. Thanks a lot, Ross.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for inviting me, and thanks for joining us today. Many of the concerns we tend to have about the platformization of life center on questions of control and extraction, the subtle yet ubiquitous techniques that promise to fundamentally alter who we are and further entrench capitalism. Dystopian imaginaries of this are rife in pop culture, yet the who we are in this seems to evade critical inquiry. Viktorija and Marta's Good Life, if you haven't seen it, complicates this imaginary. And for me, the film documents less a particular startup experiment than it charts a life organized by a platform. So not quite the dystopian imaginary that we're maybe used to. What we see in this film is the cultural excess of platform capitalism. Somehow the other side of the algorithmic constructs of individuality, of surveillance and extraction, it documents the playful, if not sometimes cringy, invention of shared cultural protocols for life at the front end of platform capitalism, a space in which technologies of control, extraction, and surveillance are the means for creative cultural experimentation, the infrastructure with which to create a new way of being, perhaps not altogether new. Of course, platform capitalism is dystopian, as Orit Halpern's work on the smartness mandate has shown through its historical formation of the regime. I'd like to approach this kind of problem from a slightly different angle by looking at resilience urbanism. So resilience, as you may know, has come to describe a now standard approach to reforming urban spaces under the conditions of climate breakdown. And without having time to go into detail, I want to make a few broad claims about this new formation. First, I'd like to suggest that resilience urbanism, in the context of this event, is a kind of meta-operation. It can be understood as a set of techniques and goals whose aim is to render smooth an existing set of operations in a world understood increasingly through the lens of crisis. Its notion of crisis, therefore, is kind of all-inclusive, and a lot of these points resonate with some of the things that Orit said yesterday, so her work is, of course, important to me as well. But there's this interesting effect of making no ontological distinction between extreme weather events, urban density, and things like terrorism in the sort of logics of resilience. The second is, rather than thinking of it as a technique to safeguard the lives of those who inhabit cities, resilience is what I call a world-preserving program, designed to secure the systems and institutions that have come to structure our present world. Like sustainability, resilience is a non-disciplinary term that has been adopted by many institutions, organizations, and practices. less in its actual spaces, the relation between resilience urbanism and things like real estate, finance, insurance, governance, logistics, and so on, is where this kind of urbanism, for me, becomes clearest. Third, resilience urbanism is a reworking of the smart city. On the one hand, by broadening its sphere of control to monitoring the environment, while on the other, shifting its mode of operation to the moderation of crises. Some of its projects are quite visible. This one is a financial district in Seaport Resiliency Master Plan by SCAPE, currently in the works. While other projects are less visible. They're sort of hiding in the background and retooling the everyday spaces of the city into a kind of coordinated system of emergency management. Finally, the body in resilience urbanism becomes an unwitting component of the organization and operation of urban space. More and more projects of resilience urbanism seem to develop strategies of design that relate global and regional conditions of risk with technologies that in turn operate directly on or from the body. We see many projects which enmesh infrastructures and bodies in environments of leisure and care. And in some cases, there's literally no distinction between bodies and infrastructure, as in the case of oyster texture, which probably many of you have seen, I assume. This is really because in the space of the resilient city, the environment is conceived of as a system of relations in which bodies are no longer ontologically external to it. Rather, instead now they sort of an equal, they're perceived as equal with any other component of the environment. The body then can thus be taken as a site of intervention in itself. The body in resilient urbanism now doubles as its object, as infrastructure, offering new ways of knowing and controlling urban space against a background of crisis. And very much like the 3D models in Good Life, there's an uncanny centrality of the body in resilience urbanism that at once takes presence as its kind of entirely open and passive form, while also being entirely redundant. This is, of course, a representation or a kind of regime of representation, but because representations have effects, I want to dwell for a moment on how the body has historically been represented, deliberately or otherwise, and how such representations may open a different history of space relevant to our present. So the relation between the body and urbanism is, of course, nothing new. As a field that concretized in the early 20th century, urbanism is shaped through and through by a metric of space which begins at those of the body. In this case, it's the normalized, naturalized, and abstracted figure of the white, male, able-bodied figure that nevertheless goes on to discipline the production of urban space internationally. So the Neufert Guide is like in every architect's and urbanist's kind of library. It's a very important tool to design a space. What's interesting in this is that as much as this idealized body serves as a measure for urban space, this representation is never far from another, which shows it to be a potential threat to the system at the same time. A kind of corruptible, violent, pathological vessel that circulates throughout the spaces of its ideal other, that its ideal other has informed. And here we might think of the work of Georges-Eugène Haussmann in Paris, whose boulevards were meant to open circulation and so forth, but also to allow for control through military interventions. This doubling comes across in an imaginary that Le Corbusier proffered, in which the body is incomplete somehow, a figure requiring some kind of techno-concrete appendage of buildings, infrastructures, and spaces to complete it. The body, in other words, calls for urbanism. But ideas like Le Corbusier's, while very well represented, let's say, were preceded by a far more exhaustive proposal, which I've explored at length in my own work. And in this, the body was central to the thinking of one of the most underexplored and understudied, yet I think very interesting figures, namely Ildefonso Cerdà. Mostly known for his plan for the Eixample of Barcelona, his life's work was actually to theorize what he called the urbe and its associated process of self-expansion. Urbanización, a term he actually coined. Of course, he didn't invent urbanization as much as he believed he had, but what I think his work does do is to illustrate in kind of diagrammatic clarity, specifically his writings, in diagrammatic clarity, a kind of space and process that was indeed new to the world, one that was, in fact, emerging all around Cerdà at the time, and that lacked a kind of clear theoretical description. As narrated by Cerdà, the urbe was to be a kind of abstracted space, reduced to but two elements. On one hand, a network of unrelenting circulation, and a grid, on the other hand, of private domesticity, so productive and reproductive labor sitting side by side. Nearly every consideration Cerdà made, every calculation he produced, from the movement of bodies in the streets to the volume of clean air that gardens needed to produce, was informed by a presumed universal figure of the human. He even went so far as to define a metric of density not as a number of people per unit of area, but rather as the amount of urbe prescribed to a single body. Most importantly, Cerdà's urbe was meant to be a deliberate technology of governance. Its aim was to both establish and kind of maintain a new kind of order altogether. The centrality of the body here is, again, telling. The urban for Cerdà was to be a machinic and biopolitical technology that would replace the state in its role of governing population, while unleashing at the same time the ascendant power of global capitalism. So for this reason, he created laws and regulations for the process of urbanization to kind of consume and reproduce space along the way. It was really endowed with the capacity to expand limitlessly across the surface of the world, reshaping it as in its kind of gridded image. Indeed, the body in the West, more largely, has offered a kind of long-standing epistemological hinge that we see in Cerdà's work between the organization of space and the ordering of power. For centuries prior to Cerdà's work, the body was taken as a kind of divine replica. As such, it became a common metaphor with which to design buildings, cities, and to organize states. And what I think is funny about this history is how it both precedes and coincides with the history of encounters with other bodies, right, in the spaces that the Europeans colonized. And I think this history, as it pertains to space, remains under-examined. Here, a kind of dichotomy emerges in which the corporeal model that for centuries offered evidence of truth, righteousness, reason, and rationality would eventually become the measure against which women's bodies and those of people from Africa, Asia, and the Americas could all be observed as part of a kind of natural, divinely ordained hierarchy, which in turn helped to legitimize their colonization, their enslavement, indentureship, and genocide. Indeed, it was this body at the dawn of capitalism that paved the way for making all others infrastructural, in rendering them as commodities, as objects. It was the epistemological foundations from which this body was made universal that would first reveal other bodies as so-called incomplete, requiring the kind of discipline of civilization and its violent rationality, if not simply their elimination. Such racialized, gendered, and othered bodies sit at the base of capitalism to this day, and it's no wonder that the urbe Cerdà narrated, in fact, took as a direct model the colonial settlement, specifically Philadelphia, which he was particularly fascinated with. This is the infamous boomerang effect that Césaire described, in which technologies and techniques deployed to control subjects in the colonial spaces increasingly come to return to discipline the metropoles. This perhaps explains why, by the late 18th century, the body that had long been a model for order is increasingly seen as a threat to order itself. If the urban, as narrated by Cerdà, is a corrective technology for reordering the world, smoothly delineating a life of private property and circulation in the centers of global capitalism, its other side, then, is the brutal extractivist colonial settlements, which, at another scale, reveals what Cerdà's urbe only implies, namely the plantation. The edgelessness of the urban, both a space and a process for Cerdà, its imperial drive to extend and to civilize, as he talked about, the four corners of the world, or in this case, to fill the earth, is all a consequence of the same Enlightenment project that the smartness mandate and resilience urbanism carry forward today. The body for which resilience urbanism designs its spaces and technologies is surely not quite the same as that for which Serda and all the modernists that followed him created in their spaces. Yet, the bodies that animate resilience urbanism are nevertheless inherited, and for this reason, I think it's important to trace historical continuities that its representations may betray. Indeed, the divinely ordained human hierarchy and order of domination that was assumed centuries ago continues to live on and is naturalized by newer Darwinian hegemony of capitalism and the consequences seen through geopolitical divisions of the world that we may clumsily refer to with notions like the global south and global north. Resilience indeed traces this as well. In the work of geographer Kasia Paprocki, for example, we see how the term animates far more troubling projects when it's exported from centers of consumption to those of global production and extraction. In what she calls the adaptation regime, crisis empowers an imaginary that specifically negates the futurity of the rural and subsistence forms of life that some spaces have sustained for centuries. So while those of us living in rich cities are encouraged to explore new relationships between urban life and the environment through resilience, others in rural Bangladesh, for example, are dispossessed and forced to become workers in ecologically disastrous large-scale agro-industrial facilities necessary for capitalism in the area. Of course, culturally homogeneous representations of the human body speak to dominant ways of being human that escape any specific cultural realm and inhabit a kind of hegemonic common sense. They are, as Sylvia Wynter would call it, genres of being human that are never actually universal but are rather overrepresented. Such overrepresentations of the human are not only reflected in the concurrent orders and organizations of space, but the organization and representation of space itself is crucial for mediating and narrating each particular mode of being human, which is why it's important, I think, to consider today. Because professionalized modes of spatial design have long taken this figure, the Homo economicus, and its Renaissance predecessor as its unannounced epistemological subjects, they've continuously worked to represent and naturalize this human as a universal, timeless figure. Space ingrains this figure in the world that sustains it into everyday experiences. Infrastructure, domesticity, urbanization, all in a way play an overbearing role in mediating our relation to the world, foreclosing our imagination of being in the world to an endless reproduction of this genre of the human. So while we continue to surveil, control, coerce, and commodify one another, I wonder how spatial practices and others can begin to narrate elements of a different story of what it means to be human otherwise. Thank you.
Ross, thanks a lot. A lot to digest and a lot to expand on. I want to first involve Marta and Viktorija as a sort of respondent maybe to this, but also to get back to a few decisive moments in your film, and where you also refer to theory, and I call it the kitchen debate, where you sit together with young entrepreneur Gustav, and you discuss with them a text by Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval, The New Way of the World on Neoliberal Society. It's from 2013. So Homo economicus had turned into the neoliberal subject. And one part you cannot discuss within reads, his or her own expert, own employer, own inventor, and own entrepreneur. Neoliberal rationality encourages the ego to act to strengthen itself so as to survive competition. All its activities must be compared with a form of production, an investment, and a cost calculation. The economy becomes a personal discipline. Margaret Thatcher, the good old Margaret Thatcher, provided the clearest formulation of this rationality. Economics are the method. The object is to change the soul. So I think I would be interested, because now we hear so much about the body, and we have this good old body-mind split, and I think, of course, we think of both together. But what I find interesting in terms of the management of the soul that is described here, Dauliūtė Laval, at one point in their text, they criticize or they define the, let's say, the historical moment of the training of the bodies, the disciplinary action on bodies, what we also heard now in Ross, how he showed it and traced it back to Cerda and so on. And you could name, of course, all the work that had Foucault provided about the disciplinary society, the panoptical prison and so forth. So saying that that's only a moment, and it's about the soul and the mind and not the body. But when I asked yesterday, because they live together in, it's a collective living scheme, the startup, and it's of course not a new invention in that sense. You have the whole counter-cultural movements of the 1960s, creating communes, all the way to the Berlin WGs, Wohngemeinschaften and so forth, and you say like, what you think is the new feature in there is what it does to the body. Can you talk about this, or the body-mind, impossible body-mind split in this case? How, yeah, what's your reflection on that against the background of tech farm?
Shall I? There's so much input. I try to synthesize it a little bit. But yes, exactly, to quote the same book, they talk about this, when they talk, Laval and Dauliūtė, they talk about this governance apparatus where the subjectivity has to be put at work. So the general principle of the apparatus of efficiency is not so much training of bodies as management of minds. And what we tried to show in the film is like how this physical body functions in the company's narrative. Oh, there is this sound. And what you said, Ross, it was so interesting. Like there is this almost, the body almost is redundant in this company's how to say building. There is just a coffin to put the body when it's not productive and when it's not consuming in a way. And then what you do, what you have instead of the private space, you have the network. So it's also almost like the network is also like this. Oh wow, that's some kind of. It's like it's also about this representation of yourself, where it's also your subjectivity is put in place somehow, and that we. But then also we discussed this like a lot, how to find the image or how to convey or how to talk about it in the film, this subjectivity and what it does to our, because in the end, it also comes back to the body gets ill. So it's also, it's not like, it's very simple, how to say, connection to it. But we were thinking a lot about that, and that would be also interesting to discuss somehow. This, But
yeah, of course, I guess if you've seen the film, you also see it's. I don't know if that's appropriate way to call it. It's very ableist space. So it is a lot about management of mind, but then what kind of body can live like this? What kind of body is permitted into this space. So in that sense, it's still, training of bodies is still very important. It's just on top of that, you have this kind of, society of control where like the control is internalized, but there's still some kind of discipline going on about what kind of bodies are permitted or not to be part of that space.
Yeah, I think that's the core question in terms of privatization, and of course the difficulty to not be able to discern where is the threshold between the two. But as you said, what I also wanted to talk about is the ill body. I mean, looking at the history of the modern urbanization had to do a lot with hygiene regimes, right? I mean, in a way to prevent, of course, the spread of sicknesses, but to this, to organize the bodies in the space in a totally different way. And I think Ross' text on breath is all about that, and also realizing that breath is something that connects us to the environment in the most crucial or most deep or most not to be able to prevent it way. And so we also had talked about that, because you have your particular experience. You're not only a tenants activist and a mapping activist, but you've been working as a nurse. So maybe you can also expand a little bit on that aspect of the of body in relation to power sickness and what it does to bodies. Also, as part of your research in Stockholm. Yeah, what's going on in terms of ownerships?
I just want to comment a little bit on what you guys were talking about in the film, and how they challenge themselves a lot. At one point, they talk about, we shouldn't talk about them, the company, and us. We are one, and this wanting to belong, and then at the same time, one of the main manager people talk about how this like radical notion, like, I don't own my own son, I don't own my wife. I mean, they're bringing in ideas that are quite like radical when it comes to what is ownership, but at the same time ignoring the fact that about like this is a challenge on their psychological health, probably about how they're going to live, how they relate to the social relations are being like very probably tense and pulled too thinly. And of course, when I work in an emergency care ward, and you see this all the time. I think that the exhausted bodies and forced to work too much and over time, and also psychologically, and all the kinds of diseases that brings. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of different studies also about what kind of sickness is more prevalent now, and especially in low-income areas, whether it be diabetes or heart. Yeah, so it's just really clear the relation to health and economy and the class, I think. And sometimes I think in the film it becomes clear that they don't want to talk about class or at all. They want to sort of, no, we're the same, and we're all going through this. But it's very hard not to see it at the same time. So it very successfully, like sort of both at this exposes, but also shows people performing the not wanting to see in a really nice way.
Or in a way somehow internalizing the company's narrative that far that if we criticize the company, it's like as if we criticize the community. So it becomes this very uncanny internalization somehow. Yeah. And to just I was thinking also it was so nice with this context. What we tried just a little bit to show this house crisis, what is it called? Marches in Berlin, just a little bit to give the context. It was so nice to also see your presentation, Sarah, because it's also like as if this visionary of these companies, as there is like nobody, so it's a no place somehow also. So as if there is we just create it because it's for the to enhance the human or something, as if it's not functioning in this crisis. And then it was also so nice to see this work that you're doing on these counter movements. And of course we were obsessed while doing the film, trying to get this dialogue, because in a way this experiment or this prototype of this house is also used as an example, as people with the endeavor, everyday endeavor, they make it livable, and so you can show that you don't need to, protest somehow. It's possible to, and it's even good. So it's like this. We really, somehow we still think like, how could we involve in this through where there is a possibility to involve in this dialogue. That's how we ourselves submit and encourage this type of development in a way. Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting, maybe, I don't know, we just had a discussion 2 days ago with our sales agent how to market the film, and we were saying, like maybe it's about the housing. There's like such a big problem with housing. Maybe it can be relevant through that perspective. And then we're discussing: is it about housing or not? And it is not, per se. Like the film is not about housing issue. I don't know in that kind of depth. But I think when we think about alternatives or like ways of resistance to this kind of neoliberal subject management, I think that's like why we ended up with this image of housing rights protest in Berlin. I just thought it's interesting that's maybe, if it's so insidious, this whole narrative. So somehow when you like, okay, how do you respond to it? That's, I guess the first priority would be to get involved in some kind of housing rights movement, what you do actually, and the work that you do in Stockholm. So I just thought that it's an interesting connection maybe there.
Yeah, and I mean, if you take Berlin, it's not only about the housing crisis or provide decent housing or affordable housing. It's of course to really ask the question of land ownership. I mean, that's what it all comes down to, right? And as you explained, and that I find puzzling, that you say, like, it's not about Tech Farm is of course in the center of Stockholm. They don't choose the land commune, and if they want to spread out and franchise, will be always the center, right, next to the investors and so forth, and of course this high-level lifestyle. But it's even the outskirts, the suburbia, where also now the other bodies had arrived. I mean, now who lives in Tenstra and Hörby? It's like migrant communities, like third, fourth generation, I suppose, And then also riots have appeared there against the constant exclusionary politics and so forth, and economic conditions. So even that is attractive for financialized capital to some extent. One practical question to Sarah, because we've been just busy with this, trying to understand better the financialization of the city, and you really got the personas of the company's CEOs. And usually that is so successfully disguised. Who's at the end of this, how you say, Briefkasten? So in all these investment fund constructs, and so in German legislation at least, you have it's very hard to track it down. So how did you, is there a transparency register or Kataster in Sweden that is much easier? In Germany it's really hard to do.
For the land ownership, you have to dig. You have to send mails and ask for, and you can only get a few at a time. So it was a big research project, and it's ongoing. I mean, will never be done. It's kind of because the ownership is changing all the time. But it was pretty heavy work, and we had a researcher come on board and help us. And but yeah, it's a lot of documents that are invisible. Like you have to ask for them. And you have to, know where to look. But when you start to try to find out and sort of detangle the structures of these, like Vonovia, for example, it's like investment banks, insurance companies. I mean, it's like a real conglomerate. And then they change the name, and then the ones that they are in different countries have another name, and then so it's a real maze to figure out who and how they're all connected. But in the end, they are connected by this global, sort of capital and oligarchical kind of sort of infrastructure of land grabbing, and so very quickly you think, oh, this is a local thing, but no, it's actually. Person's from Israel, and this person is also active, and they have land here. So it becomes immediately like a global project. But yeah, not easy to do the research on. Actually, we needed help.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's very important because that's something we are increasingly faced, and it feels so abstract. So it tricks you to say, okay, this is something I will never be able to tackle, to grasp, right? And that's the power of it, of that scheme of abstraction. Ross, I would like to, because I love so much your essay on breath, and it's, I think, also, of course, it relates very much to what you've introduced, but maybe more precisely, could you give a short wrap-up of that, or this idea, or how you discuss the breath. In terms of the urban, let's say, urban development, but what you say is like breath teaches us to see the world anew. So there's this inseparability. It's all connected and tangled. We had that reappearing through discussions in the festival, and this will accompany us to the very end of it. But then maybe more in to also take you on your last words, where you said like, okay, we need the new narratives here and or imaginaries. Can you expand on those to give us examples? And then this in relation to breath, because you related also to this how to say, the resilient urbanism to find nature-based solutions, and nature understand as the system of entangled relationships. So where you see to go with that and not get into this trap of this totally algorithmically organized, controlled body, mind.
Okay, lots there. I think I'm really interested in, as you say, like ways of seeing the world otherwise, because I feel like the way we somehow, or leaving that sort of zone of struggle out somehow always ends up limiting what we can do in the world, limiting how we can respond to power and so forth and capital. And I think, you know, this idea of complexity that we see in the financial markets, this complexity of, you know, climates and so on, really irons into our way of understanding the world collectively as through this inevitability, right? We can only hope, right? And this is something, you know, that Orit's work and hopeful resilience and so forth talks about a little bit. But for me, like the idea of hope coincides really with systems of mystification, and the mystification that we see in things like finance, I think is somehow related to the fact that finance is a future-oriented practice, and it is about constructing futures, literally.
What finance market is all about.
Right, futures markets. And in a way, it mirrors a lot of the, or the ways in which, you know, the question of the future has always been a site of struggle between power and those who want to kind of liberate themselves. So I guess I'm really interested in, you know, in understanding the kind of common sense, the hegemonic structures that enable us to continue seeing the world in a specific way and therefore shaping our responses to the world, and trying to find other ways that we can start to, you know, depict, represent, and therefore enable, you know, different worlds to come into being. I guess this is at the basis of my work. So I really liked, Sarah, in your case, you talked about maps as unfolding, which I think is a really interesting unfolding potentials, like sites of imagination. I would love to hear more about that. Also, especially in relation to this question of like struggles over future worlds that are different from the one that's like bearing down on us right now.
Yeah, I think that it's really useful. I think we chose this subway map, for example, because people know it immediately and they can relate to the spaces and sort of place themselves there, and then look, okay, that owner is also the owner of that other local center, and maybe we can like ideally collaborate and struggle together and sort of hopefully be starting a discussion also like about who is the owner. But at the same time, it depends on who you are when you read the map. I think some people can look, I remember in the beginning, like if you're like a capitalist, venture capitalist, and you look at the map and you're like, oh wow, they're doing really well, like they've got that center and that center. So it can be read in that opposite way. So it's kind of better with the digital map where you can also add text and give stories. And I think that like mapping as a process and using it and keeping it alive is like sort of it's more like a way of thinking in order to grasp what is happening, because I think we're always disoriented, and I think everything around us in our daily lives is trying to like distract us and, you know, mystify. So to have some concrete sort of tools and sort of that ground us, like understanding, okay, who owns this space? Like, how does that reveal the, you know, the class difference? How do I feel in this space because I know it's owned by somebody else? If I know it's common, how do I feel? And I think that like entering spaces and having this like cognitive sort of experience and without knowing it yourself, you don't know how people will experience this room or wherever you are. So you come with your own baggage, and then if you have some map that like gives you little tips and hints, it can maybe set you on a path into thinking in a direction that helps you, you know. Yeah.
Please join us. Are there any questions, comments from you in the audience to one of us? Yes, please.
Hi, I saw Good Life last night but had to leave before the discussion, but I was very keen to find out how it is going there. There were, you mentioned there the challenge for the people there of trying to adapt to the situation. So are you keeping in touch and sort of being aware of how the people are, using the word surviving there, but that's not the right word.
Shall I? As Viktorija, you mentioned once in one presentation, there is a little hope that all these places are getting bankrupt. It's like, as with WeWork, we live, and so on. It's it got bankrupt as it didn't work out as this kind of expansion, and this idea of expansion, and maybe there were some private problems or something, but it didn't work out as a startup. So it was saved by a philanthrope, and people took over. But we haven't visited the space now, and this is what we're going to do in the next stage with this film, also maybe to show and to try to talk and also connect to your what you just said. How does it feel to be in a space when it's like, how does this ownership, like how this idea of ownership and how this idea of organization changed when there is no company, but in the end there is still some philanthropist guy. So we don't know yet. So I cannot answer, but we're also very keen to find out.
Shall look out for the sequel. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, what did I say?
I will watch out for the sequel.
Yeah.
Oh, but it's really run by the residents, and
yeah,
that's what we've been told.
That's what we've been told.
Yes. People at least that lived there at the time, so the kind of the community took over, but we're not sure what kind of community it is still. Yeah. Maybe there's another investor involved, or
and what their visions with this community is. Like, do they still keep this idea of expansion, for instance? We don't know, so we need to go back and to map out and all these different power dynamics existed there now. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting maybe in terms of this mystification and financialization somehow, that these co-living businesses, I think after the pandemic, I don't know, I didn't like do thorough research, it's just some kind of feeling. They either became very pragmatic, and it's like very straight on marketing, you know, you're new to the city, you don't want to like waste time looking for a place, you pay, I don't know, 1,000 euros and you have
coffee.
Yes, a place to stay, or like they kind of, there's this whole story about WeWork and how it all was overvalued, and it's actually, running real estate is a difficult business. You cannot, just, you're still dealing with people, with space, and it's kind of interesting to think that this materiality somehow strikes back. And it's not easy to run 100 locations around the world.
Maybe there or that, let's say, real estate revolution eats its own children by, very easily, and And quickly you cannot afford their own space anymore, you know, by what you just kind of, the incentives you gave to the rise of prices, I can imagine. That's also a big problem then. Anybody else?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for the inspiring presentation and screening also yesterday. I have a question, maybe for Ross or for all. I was very intrigued with your like showing this rationalization of the city and taking this standard body as a measure, othering other bodies. But another process that was equally important in the birth of the modern city, the with hygiene and everything, was the expulsion of animals. This was something that was also already put in place much earlier with zoning and everything, of course. But now in this more smart city, in this resilient city, we see animals and nature slowly coming back, but then in a complete different way. But if you think about permaculture, roofs, vertical gardening, and all this kind of very rationalized and domesticized nature, maybe. So how do you see, because this maybe also links a little bit to another theme in the festival, which is our relationship to animals. But how do you see that in relation to the platform city? What is the role of animals there?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer per se about animals. What I think the smart city opened up and that the resilient city kind of continues with is the ability to think about design of space in a so-called anti-modern way. And there was a lot of hype in the beginning of the whole resilience thing about approaching the city with a sort of Jane Jacobs vibe of like keeping everything gritty as we love it, while radically transforming the way that space is understood and operated through networked computation and so forth. So I think it allows us to celebrate nature and kind of have a very let's say a closer relationship, if that can be called as such, within urban space at a time of climate change and the destruction of nature. But also very much, resilience takes that a step further and really operates at this sort of interface between, without saying it directly, like a kind of, human space and the non-human space of nature outside, which tends to be like a kind of thickened band at the coastline of most of these projects. As I finished with this image, one of the images I finished with, there's a tendency within urban resilience projects in spaces of richer cities to depict nature as sort of this newly domesticated yet rewilded kind of substance that it almost looks, first of all, like summer never ends, which is perhaps a new reality, I don't know, but also that climate change no longer exists. And the funny thing is resilience tends to not, it's much more about adaptation rather than mitigation. So like sustainability was, in very broad brushstrokes, sustainability was about creating measures that would, reduce ecological footprints and so on. Whereas resilience is kind of the oh shit moment of like, let's build a seawall, but call it a berm and make it, ecological and so forth. And so there's a lot of fantasies, running through that, I think, that should be probably unpacked a little bit.
Turn this new volatility into opportunity, right? And
that too.
Also make that in business operation. But I think just a little comment, Michelle, I found really interesting what you said, and taking the example of Berlin helps us also. We talked all about the city, but we need to also see the cities in relation to other spaces, especially the land around it. And so for Berlin, or how that turned around, Berlin is maybe a special case because it has this very particular 20th century history where lots of barren land was created throughout the war and then not built over and not accessed by people. So it's a very incredibly biodiverse place. with a very particular urban fauna and flora. And now if you look around and you have industrialized agriculture, which kills insects and so forth, you have the city itself more biodiverse. You have more bees in the city than in the countryside because the pesticides just eliminates them. So how these things are flipped. And of course there I see also, just look at these renderings, that's just totally tamed nature, and it's all like, you know, so as you say, this rewilded substances, also, but to what extent that that goes, it's an open question. But of course, when we talk about the city, we need to see the other spaces in that relationship that sustains the city at the same time. But they are more and more crucial also as nature space and space of preservation for certain species. So that makes it even more complex.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is what like Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt have talked about as planetary urbanization, probably a term many of you are familiar with, but it's exactly this kind of resistance in seeing this dichotomy between city and countryside, but like mapping also comes back to mapping as well, like how we can understand the urban as a sort of planetary, continuous, yet variegated technology, really.
One last question.
Thank you. Thank you all for your inspiring talks. What I got from it mostly was, you could say that in all cases, you were describing how the platformization of urban life leads to new exclusionary practices, right? Whether it's global real estate capital, or whether it's rhetorics of resilient smart cities, or I guess in the case of your film, which unfortunately I haven't seen, but I will, it's probably the rise of so-called creative tech business and how that leads to a new kind of disciplined workforce in a sense. Now, I was also interested in the inverse. Is it possible for you to maybe speculate a little bit on how the ongoing platformization of cities might also lead to new forms of inclusion and ways of new, for example, commonality or new types of commons to arise? So just your sort of speculative thought on that, please.
I don't know, maybe Ross knows more. I guess there's like interesting citizen science projects, maybe if, you know, if it is possible to think of platform city outside of these corporations, but more as a, I don't know whether I can come up only with citizen science projects, but maybe there's some kind of other community-based initiatives that use all these sensors and network and so forth, but to different means somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe
you know more.
Do this better than I can.
I'm not sure. I've been so like focused on how it's been so used for like surveillance and sort of accelerating and amplifying exploitation. So I think that if we lived in a world where the resources and it was more like another situation where profit wasn't so important, I'm sure there'd be amazing results for all of these ideas.
I mean, I think a lot of platforms are able to be co-opted and used as, you know, people would like. What comes to mind is something like Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, 2013, I guess. And it's interesting, you know, a lot of mutual aid groups that were born out of the Occupy movement began to carry on their work in helping people who were stranded and left without power and water and food and everything, and you know, in ways that were much more effective than like FEMA and the official responses. And I think you know, there are those examples, but it's also the case that, you know, resilience emerges with such strength as a discourse, specifically in New York and the projects that came after that, almost as a way to control that and to kind of, you know, go against these sorts of organizations. So I think there's always a struggle below the surface that if we're not attentive to it, we might miss. So Yeah. I think in terms of resilience, sorry, one last thing, I guess. There are certain kind of hard boundaries, to carry on the kind of resilience urbanism that we see happening, through corporations and various consultancies and so forth, requires a lot of capital. And so it's no wonder that you see a lot focusing on things like the financial district in Manhattan, or other areas or you can look at Miami and the displacement of people who are generally poor, living in Little Haiti, let's say, which is a few meters above sea level, so that rich people can go and live more secure lives. So there's always, when you make one area more resilient, you by definition make other areas that aren't, with that technology and so forth, less resilient, more exposed. So for me, this kind of Darwinian logic that underpins, everything really, but it can be really terrifying to see, if we start to look at the outsides of these projects a little bit.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, Viktorija, Marta, Sarah, and Ross. And let me announce our next program, which is in Studio 3. It's a short film screening entitled Place of History, and we have filmmaker Johannes Girlinger here in presence for the Q&A after the program. That starts at 5, so it leaves you with enough time for coffee or first, biertje. Or water, and then I hope to see you up there. Thanks.
Thank you.